Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar. It's 2 o'clock Eastern, so we're going to go ahead and get started right on time because we've got a lot of information to get through. We want to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions and answers. So today's webinar is called Building Connections: How Communities Can Use Federal Funds to Connect People to Place, Opportunity, and Each Other. This webinar is being presented by Safe Routes Partnership. We are a national nonprofit organization that works to advance safe walking and rolling to and from schools and in everyday life. And we do this with the goal of improving the health and well-being of people of all races, income levels, abilities, and disabilities, and really with the core goal of building healthy, thriving communities for everyone. I know that we are probably all Zoom professionals by now, but just in case, I'd like to go over a couple of Zoom housekeeping items. So in terms of audio, attendees will be muted on audio during the presentation, but you're welcome to say hi in the chat. We ask that you put your questions into the question and answer box, but you can also put them in the chat. You are able to join and listen in either through the phone or using your computer's audio. And the chat is open. Again, please feel free to submit questions and comments. We prefer if you put your questions for presenters in the Q&A box, just it's a little bit easier for us to keep track. But if you've got questions, you can drop them in the chat too, and you can do that by clicking on the little Q&A box or the chat in the taskbar at the bottom of your screen. So let's talk about our agenda today. So often when we host webinars, we have them for 60 minutes, but given the fact that we have a lot of content and we know that people often have a lot of questions about federal funding, we did set aside 75 minutes for today's call. We want to make sure that we give you enough information and have enough time for questions. So just wanted to set that out from the beginning. So we'll start by introducing our terrific panel of presenters. We'll frame the conversation, and we'll highlight a number of these funding opportunities, and then we'll shift over to questions and answers. So our esteemed panel for today, oh, I didn't introduce myself. Hi, everyone. I'm Marisa Jones, they, she, her pronouns. I'm the Director of Policy and Partnerships at Safe Routes Partnership. I'm based in Philadelphia. And I'm joined today by Stephanie Flynn, who is the Federal Grants Manager at Trust for Public Lands, and Carolyn Burnt, who is the Legislative Director for Sustainability at the National League of Cities. And we are so pleased to have our colleague Melanie Robinson, who is the Program Manager for Children and Nature at the National League of Cities, who will be moderating the question and answer portion of our webinar today. So we'd like to start today with a poll. We know that we have a lot of people here. Our 3 organizations invited our networks and our respective fields. And while we have a lot of shared goals, we also touch very specific fields and audiences. And so we would love it if you could please take a moment to participate in the poll and let us know what sector you represent. Okay, so looks like about a third local government, a quarter nonprofits, 10 to 15% transportation, public health, state governments, a smaller number of folks from environmental organizations and community economic development organizations. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. Okay, so yeah, about a third from local governments, a quarter from nonprofits, and then 10 to 15% from state governments, transportation, and public health. So thanks so much, everybody, for sharing that. And I do want to flag that a lot of the federal funding opportunities that we're going to share and present on today are available to government agencies, mostly local governments, but several of them are available to nonprofit organizations. And so we're going to make sure that we flag those for you when you are eligible to apply. But certainly there's a role for nonprofit organizations in knowing about and encouraging communities to apply for these different funds. Okay, so let's move on. I want to talk about really setting the stage for this webinar and this conversation. So as we mentioned, and as you read in the description, today's webinar will share several funding opportunities available to communities for a variety of purposes: arts, engagement, transportation, environmental sustainability. But at their core, these funding opportunities are really about building and strengthening communities. And while each of our organizations, Safe Routes Partnership, National League of Cities, and Trust for Public Land, have our own specific missions, visions, and audiences, we have a lot of shared values and goals. And one of those shared goals is to make access to parks, nature, and green space easier, safer, and more equitable. We recognize the myriad benefits that parks and green space have for our communities. They're places where people can connect to each other. They're places to be physically active, get some fresh air and space from the stressors of daily life. And we also recognize the environmental health benefits that green spaces offer our communities: trees purifying the air and soil managing stormwater. And the funding opportunities that we share today can be used for a variety of purposes, not just improving parks and nature, but we're going to make connections between these funding opportunities and improved access to the outdoors, because we believe that parks and access to green space is so fundamental for strong, thriving people and communities. We also recognize that while each of our organizations have our areas of expertise that we share out with you, our network, the work to create strong, thriving communities where people have access to parks and other amenities, that this work is interconnected. And so I know even for Safe Routes Partnership, our audience hears a ton about the transportation funding opportunities, but we don't really know about the arts funding opportunities. And I know there are similar parallels for our colleagues here. And so we really thought it would be beneficial to bring together our organizations to share with each other our different areas of expertise. And we recognize that there are co-benefits of working together and our interconnected work. And one of the ways that we structured this webinar today is that we are so entrenched in this work that we use acronyms for these funding opportunities, and we make a lot of assumptions that you all know what these funding opportunities are. And so we really wanted to shift today to talk about what are the benefits that these different funding opportunities can bring to communities. And so here's just like a little word cloud of some of the co-benefits of the different funding opportunities that we will present on our. And with that, I am so excited to pass the mic over to Stephanie from Trust for Public Land to present.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marisa. Great to be here presenting alongside the Safe Routes Partnership and National League of Cities. So really excited to be here. Again, my name is Stephanie Flynn, and I am the Trust for Public Land's Federal Grants Manager. And before I dive in, I'm just going to give a brief overview of the Trust for Public Land. We are a national nonprofit organization, and our mission is to create parks and protect land for people, ensuring healthy, livable communities for generations to come. And next slide. Since 1972, we have worked hand in hand with communities to connect millions of people to the benefits and joys of the outdoors through over 5,000 park, schoolyard, trail, and iconic outdoor places, through billions of dollars in public funding, and millions of acres of protected public land. So the first couple of programs that I'm going to talk about today are from the National Endowment for the Arts. And these programs are really important for just to be incorporated in even the creation of parks and public spaces because they not only do the projects that they support benefit communities immensely, but they can also, these two programs can cover the soft costs that a lot of other federal funding programs will not, such as community engagement. Next slide. So the first program from the National Endowment for the Arts is called the Grants for Arts Projects Program. And this program it's not focused solely on improving public places, but it is one of the many activities or outcomes that can be done through this program. The goal of the Grants for Arts Projects program is that through project-based funding, the program will support public engagement with and access to various forms of art across the nation, the creation of art, learning in the arts at all stages of life, and the integration of the arts into the fabric of community life. This program provides benefits to communities through really authentic community engagement, equity, and health. The projects that the NEA typically supports and that often get funded through this program do support underserved or underrepresented communities, communities of color, or communities that have high levels of poverty. And there are also studies that place-based arts and culture can address things like collective trauma, racism, social isolation, and exclusion, as well as mental health and certain chronic diseases. And that's also on top of all of the many health benefits that come from the creation of parks and public spaces. So this program funds community engagement. Just different type of community meetings and workshops, cleanup events and celebrations, art activities, and one of NEA's biggest priorities is funding artists directly, so using those federal funds to give them directly to artists. And also wanted to note that this is one of the programs that nonprofits can apply directly for. One of the examples of a project that was funded through this program that TPL worked with one of our partners at the Denver Urban Gardens in 2016, I believe. Doug received a $20,000 grant from this program to Freedom Park in Denver. And this park had already been transformed from a vacant lot into a beautiful community park that included a garden, soccer field, seating and play spaces. And it delivered these assets to a unique community filled with a high percentage of immigrants and refugees. However, the signature shade tree from this park was removed due to some safety concerns. And new tree care had been a persistent challenge. So at the time, there were no other trees in the park. There was some unintentional degradation of, recently planted trees due to just the high number of people that use the park. So this grant really allowed Denver Urban Gardens to engage with the community, to deliver a message of stewardship and tree care, to pave the way for future tree plantings. And the shade sculpture that you see here is providing culturally appropriate and meaningful solution to replace the beloved signature shade tree that was removed. The next program is the Our Town program, which focuses on creative placemaking. And the goal of this program is to fund projects that integrate arts, culture, and design into local efforts that strengthen communities. And they're really looking for projects that advance systems change. So whether that's economic change, physical change, or social outcomes in communities. And similarly to the first program from the NEA, although slightly different, the goals of community engagement, equity, and health are incorporated into the program goals with the hope that those outcomes come through in the project implementation. And similarly, it can provide like similar types of activities to the ones I described, community engagement, arts activities like murals and sculptures. But it also has to have the goal of influencing larger kind of systems change. So whether that's, the creation of a park or public space, or bigger policies such as citywide master plans, incorporation of, environmental justice into city policies and plans, and other types of systems change. And one thing that I did want to note here is that public-private partnerships, so between like a local government and a nonprofit organization, are required to apply for this program. So just wanted to make note of that. And one example of a project that was funded through this program was at the Chiloquin Schoolyard in Oregon. So in 2021, Trust for Public Land received a $75,000 award from the NEA. The Chiloquin is the ancestral homeland and administrative seat of the Klamath tribes. And this grant enabled community building, healing, and health promotion through the design and redevelopment process of this schoolyard, where we transformed a paved and unsafe schoolyard into a new, vibrant community park space. And this grant, we worked with tribal leaders, the school district, community organizations, and artists to support the design of the schoolyard, to engage with the community around this project, and to create interpretive signage, a mural, and other creative elements that incorporate the Klamath tribe's native language, connection to place, and ancestral practices into the schoolyard, to really unite and co-create opportunities to heal in this rural community. So after the webinar today, and Marisa can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we will be sharing these slides with all of these links on them. So feel free to check them out. The first two are just links to the program websites with some information about grant awards and timing. And then the last two resources are toolkits and guides from the Trust for Public Land that talk about, basically helping folks like you advocate for arts in parks and outdoor spaces. And then the next two programs that I'm going to be talking about are from the Land and Water Conservation Fund State Assistance Programs, ORLP, the Outdoor Recreation Legacy Partnership, and LWCF Stateside. And I believe I'm running short on time here, so I'm going to try to go through this quick. But so ORLP is a nationally competitive federal funding program that's dedicated to equitable parks access and outdoor recreation opportunities. This is a currently open grant opportunity through the National Park Service. So if you're interested, I would definitely recommend looking into it. But this year, the administration has really chosen to focus on these specific benefits, the climate resilience, equity, and health in the program guidelines, to ensure that parks and outdoor recreation amenities that are created through this program really take into consideration things like heat island effect, climate and stormwater resilience, and the mental and physical health benefits that parks can provide. And in addition, the overall program really focuses mainly on equity. The program does have a census tract level poverty requirement that says that the target community must have a poverty level of at least 20%. So they are really focused on having those equity outcomes in this program. The program does fund primarily the acquisition and development of land for public outdoor recreation. So, think parks, trails, playgrounds, things like pools and spray pads, sports fields, and courts. There are some restrictions for indoor facilities, but support facilities like bathrooms are eligible. And the lead applicants, the project sponsors for this program are local and state government agencies. So only government agencies are eligible to apply, and they must represent a city of town of 30,000 people or more. One example of a project that was funded by ORLP is in Bridgeport, Connecticut. In 2015, in close partnership with TPL, the city requested a $375,000 grant to transform Johnson Oak Park, which you'll see here, which is adjacent to the Jetty S. Tisdale School in the east end of Bridgeport. And this park is the only park in the eastern half of Bridgeport's East End neighborhood. And before renovation, the park was, pretty empty. There really wasn't much to do. But with this LWCF ORLP funding, the project developed picnic groves for community gathering, a spray pad, an adjacent comfort station, improved play equipment with safety surfacing, fitness zones, an outdoor classroom, and improvements for playing field. So a really great community asset. I did also want to just highlight that though this program is relatively new, it was only created in 2014 with a rather small budget. Today, it is appropriated at one of the highest levels it's ever been to date. On the next slide, you'll see that this year it was appropriated at $110 million, and the current grant round has $192 million available. And this is due in part to the full and permanent funding of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And we are really thrilled to see this investment into equitable parks and outdoor recreation access. One thing I did want to highlight on this helpful links and resources is TPL's ORLP grant application toolkit, which we recently created to support applicants of this program in the creation of their proposals. So definitely check that out and let me know if you have any questions. And then the last program that I wanted to highlight is the LWCF stateside program. This program is similar to ORLP in that it is run through the same state and local assistance program of the Land and Water Conservation Fund, but it is a bit more flexible, I would say, than ORLP. It doesn't have the same requirements, and it is administered at the state level. So you are only competing with people in your state for this funding. Every state does have different requirements, so I would definitely look into what those requirements are for your specific state. And while it doesn't necessarily have the same goals as the ORLP program, a lot of the outcomes can be the same. So the climate resilience, health, and equity definitely can be benefits of projects done through this program, as well as mobility, as I do think that trails are much more frequently done through this program, although they can also be done through the ORLP program. An example of how this project or how this funding was used, or we are currently pursuing to use for stateside, is the Shoreview project in Windsor, Colorado. So in partnership with the city of Greeley and the town of Windsor, TPL is currently working to acquire a 1,000-acre natural area to restore its habitat and to see it open to the public for hiking, mountain biking, and camping. So this was I believe, over $1 million request from LWCF stateside. And this property is located on the Poudre River. I apologize if I totally butchered that, but it's directly adjacent to multiple housing developments and a new bus stop that will link the property with East Greeley, where there is a large immigrant and refugee population that TPL is also working with. On this slide, there are a few more resources. There's a past project map that I would definitely recommend folks looking at. You can see how much money is available in your state through the FY22 total apportionments. And then my last three slides, I won't go through, but I just wanted to share these tables with folks that kind of show a side-by-side comparison of the programs for everyone to see and just, consider if you are looking at either of these programs. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. Really appreciate hearing about those opportunities from you. And I know folks that attend our regular Safe Routes Partnership webinars have not heard about those before. So I hope that this was a learning opportunity for many of you, and that when Carolyn presents now, that several of you will be exposed to additional new funding opportunities. So with that, I will turn it over to Carolyn.
Okay, we can go right to the next slide. Thank you, Marisa and Stephanie. NLC is pleased to partner with the Safe Routes Partnership and Trust for Public Land on this webinar today. So National League of Cities is the voice of America's cities, towns, and villages, representing 19,000 cities, towns, and villages, and more than 200 million people. We work with 49 state municipal leagues, so not Hawaii. I don't think I saw anyone posting in the chat that they're on today from Hawaii. And the other thing I'll mention is that at least 50% or more of our membership is considered a small city with a population under 50,000. Next slide. NLC works to strengthen local leadership, influence federal policy, and drive innovative solutions. Next slide. So the first program I want to talk about today is the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. And this has a number of community benefits. Important for today is the connection to green infrastructure, but it's really about projects that will help your community meet the goals of the Clean Water Act. And with that, I want to give a special shout out to the Clean Water Act on this 50th anniversary. So there are 11 project categories for eligible uses, and you can see them on the slide there. But I should also note that it does include eligibility around planning, design, and construction, around wastewater treatment plants and what have you, but not for operation and management. So this is a program, and together with the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund that is operated at the state level. Local governments and water utilities are eligible to apply. The first step in the process, each state will have a different timetable and process really, but the first step is to get your project on the state priority list. And that's really about submitting a good project narrative and gaining, the state will rank it and give points to your project. Once you're on the priority list, depending on the amount of funding that's going to your state, they'll be able to fund the top projects. And that's when you get on the intended use plan that has to be approved by EPA. So with the bipartisan infrastructure law, there is a lot of money flowing into this revolving fund. And there are other revolving funds as well that are dedicated for lead service line replacement and PFAS, and again, on the drinking water side. But with the Clean Water SRF, states are required to give out 49% of their funding as principal forgiveness or grants. Oh, I'm sorry, I see there's a typo on that slide. Supposed to be principal forgiveness or grants, and 51% will go out towards loans. We can make sure that that gets corrected on the version that gets sent out. And in order to qualify for that grant application or the principal forgiveness, it's really about meeting your state's definition of a disadvantaged community or your state affordability criteria, which again is kind of determined at the state level. We can go to the next slide. So a few examples here of actual projects that were awarded clean water SRF loans. And I won't really go through all of this, but you can see here, a lot of the examples I pulled out are about addressing flooding and stormwater management, which again creates those green infrastructure opportunities in communities. The first one here in Delaware combined a brownfields remediation project with some stormwater project, replacing the combined sewer system with a separate sanitary system, and it allowed for the establishment of conservation area turning into a wetland. And that's kind of the same with the project in Rhode Island. It combined a brownfields cleanup project with some stormwater improvements, creating public accessible green space for the community. And we can go to the next slide. These are some links to learn more about the SRF, the State Revolving Fund. So first is, what can you use it for? That document will tell you all of the eligible uses of the SRF. And the second one is really a memo from EPA to the states outlining the certain criteria that states have to follow in terms of awarding the bipartisan infrastructure law funding. NLC did a fact sheet on clean water infrastructure uses, and this is particularly for ARA, which allowed eligible use under this category, but also can be helpful in general in terms of defining what types of projects are eligible. And then I mentioned that these are state-run programs, so there's a list to your state contacts. And then another document that really gives some environmental benefits and green infrastructure examples with the Clean Water SRF. So moving on, we have the Carbon Reduction Program, which will fund a wide range of projects designed to reduce carbon dioxide emissions from on and off road sources. And one of the main benefits here is the creation of transportation alternatives. So eligible projects can include facilities, trail facilities for pedestrians or bicyclists or non-motorized forms of transportation, such as zero emission vehicles and facilities projects that support congestion pricing and travel demand strategies, truck stop and port electrification systems to reduce environmental impacts with freight movement or carbon dioxide emissions. And again, public transportation projects such as the construction of bus rapid transit corridors or dedicated bike lanes or bus lanes or bike lanes, and micromobility and electric bike projects. So this program is, again, a formula program to states, but 65% of that must be obligated to urban areas in a proportion relative to their share of the state population. So for example, urbanized areas with a population over 200,000, between 50 to 200,000, under 50, and so forth. But the key here is that it creates a need for state, regional, and local officials to work together to identify key projects, and local officials can be the best advocates for the projects in their community. The states will be working to develop a strategy in 1 year from now, and it must be done in consultation with your metropolitan planning organization. But these funds can be used before a strategy is created. And so to get access to that as early as possible, local leaders should come to the table with shovel-ready ideas or projects that can reduce transportation emissions. And next slide. And this is a new program, so we don't actually have examples of grantee awards yet, but here are some examples of what cities are doing now to reduce emissions from transportation that would likely qualify. We have examples of creating that 15-minute walkable neighborhood, using transit and shared transportation options, electric vehicles and charging infrastructure, and decreasing vehicle miles traveled through multimodal transportation and transit-oriented development. And on the next slide, we have links to the guidance for this program, which is operated under the Federal Highway Administration, the guidance document and a fact sheet. We have a couple of documents that NLC has produced, or blogs and documents, and a couple of other partner links as well. And finally, I want to talk about the Community Development Block Grant. This is really the bread and butter, if you will, for local communities. It provides grants to help create viable urban communities through housing and expanded economic opportunities for low and moderate income persons. This is a very flexible program that includes a variety of uses around affordable housing, infrastructure, and public facility improvements, economic development, social services, and all of the areas where all of those things overlap. These funds can also be used for planning, design, and construction purposes, but not operation and maintenance. And in terms of how to apply, metro cities that are 50,000 or more and counties that are 200,000 or more receive a formula allocation from HUD. Smaller communities and counties will apply through their state. Next slide. And again, some project examples here. You'll see that a lot of this is around creating parks and playgrounds where there's that community access, addressing could potentially address stormwater issues, could also address environmental justice issues. And this Detroit example is another example of the Brownfields Revitalization Project, because CDBG can also be used for that as well. And on the next slide, some additional resources on CDBG, some information from HUD on how to access, and some case studies again on using these funds. I also want to mention some upcoming resources from National League of Cities. We'll have a blog out, I think, next week on using federal funds to connect children to nature, along with an interactive guidance tool that identifies some key programs for local governments and project examples, and again, includes links to all of the program information for you to learn more and apply directly to these funds. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Marisa.
Thanks so much, Carolyn. Really appreciate you taking the time to share about those programs. And with that, I will jump into some of the programs that Safe Routes Partnership is very aware of and eager to present on. So the first one that I'll start with is called the Transportation Alternatives Program. And some of the benefits that this offers, I mean, I could go on endlessly, but the ones that I wanted to highlight are mobility, so really how people are getting around, improved safety, particularly for people outside of cars, and health through physical activity that comes with walking or bicycling. And in terms of what it funds, Transportation Alternatives is the major source of federal transportation funding for bicycling, walking, and safe routes to school. About half of all federal funding for walking, biking, and safe routes to school comes from the Transportation Alternatives Program. And of all the bicycle and pedestrian and safe routes to school needs and the programs for which they're eligible, Transportation Alternatives is the one that has the greatest eligibility for walking, biking, and safe routes to school. Similar to what Stephanie shared on the ORLP, I wanted to just share this graph that was created by our friends at the League of American Bicyclists that shows how much funding is available for transportation alternatives each year. So with the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law, funding dramatically increased. So last year in fiscal year 21, I guess it's 2 years ago now, there was $850 million a year. That went up to $1.3 billion in fiscal year 22. And you can kind of see that that amount is going to go up each year. So really just want to emphasize that there's a lot of money available, about $1.5 billion a year over the next 5 years. Who's eligible to apply? So I have a slide that goes into greater detail on this, but this is one that I do want to call out that nonprofits are eligible to apply for. So we typically see primarily local governments as some of the primary applicants. And I also want to call out that schools and school districts are eligible to apply. And on this slide that I'm not going to read in detail, you can read the greater eligibilities for projects and the entities that are eligible to apply. So our organization really typically talks about the transportation eligibility for transportation alternatives, sidewalks, bike lanes, safe routes to school. But I do also want to flag that there are some opportunities for things like environmental mitigation, provided that they have a nexus with transportation. And an example of, sorry, I want to say one more thing about funding. So similar to a lot of the programs that my colleagues presented on, this is one that there's federal funding that gets passed through to the state. And so you will apply to your state. Or if you live in a city, you would apply to your metropolitan planning organization. And just to put a finer point on how much money is available, the state that's getting the smallest amount of money this year is getting $5 million for transportation alternatives, and the state that's getting the most is getting $133 million. So there's a lot of money available for this program, and you should definitely check out your state's information on it. So I'm excited to share this example of transportation alternatives in action, because this is a project that Safe Routes Partnership had a small hand to play in. So through our Safe Routes to Parks Activating Communities program, we had the opportunity to work with the Central Arkansas Library System based in Little Rock, Arkansas. And as part of their Safe Routes to Parks work, they were really focused on connecting the Children's Library, the War Memorial Park, and Little Rock Zoo with a residential neighborhood. And what was separating people from these amazing community assets was a highway, Interstate 630. So as part of their Safe Routes to Parks work, they did robust community engagement to understand what would people like to see, what would make it easier to connect between where people live and these amazing community assets, and identified that this bridge on Interstate 630 that's currently 4 traffic lanes for cars, if there was a way to make it easier and safer and more pleasing for people to walk and bike, that would be a great community linkage. And so as part of their Safe Routes to Parks project, they piloted a lane, a pop-up project that connected people on foot and on bike between the neighborhoods and the library and War Memorial Park. And this project received a lot of positive community support and feedback, such that the city of Little Rock applied for Transportation Alternatives program funding to make this project permanent. And they were awarded $1 million in Transportation Alternatives program funds to start to make this a reality. So you can see the bottom is a rendering. I'm a very visual learner. So if you are curious, like, oh, how do you take this 4-lane bridge down to 2 lanes for cars and 2 lanes for people walking and biking, you can see that rendering on the bottom. I also want to highlight the Safe Routes to School program, which used to be a standalone federal program, but now it is an eligible program within a number of the federal funding streams, including the Transportation Alternatives program. And this offers, again, like, to go on forever about the benefits that this offers, but some of the benefits it offers are health through improved physical activity for kids and their family members, walking and bicycling, improved quality of life, feeling good and energized in the morning rather than frustrated sitting in traffic. There's research that improves an active walk or bike ride to school to academic performance and to increase or decrease absenteeism. And one of the really wonderful things about Safe Routes to School is that in a lot of communities, the school grounds, the school yard is also the play space or the playground for the community. And so making sure that it's easy to walk or bike to school for kids while they're there for learning and for recess is also a place where maybe Zumba is held on the weekends or communities gather and play and spend time outside. And in terms of what it funds planning and construction of sidewalks, bike lanes, traffic calming, crosswalks, basically bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure within 2 miles of a kindergarten through 12th grade school. And then it also can fund non-infrastructure. It can fund education and encouragement events and programming. And that's one that we see a lot of nonprofits leading, is really that the non-infrastructure programmatic side of Safe Routes to School. So this is another one that I'll flag that nonprofits are eligible to apply. And basically all the eligible entities, the entities that are eligible to apply for transportation alternatives can also apply for Safe Routes to School. So I wanted to highlight this. This is, I don't know if they're on the call today, but the Safe Routes to School program in the Wood River Valley. It's run by Mountain Guides. I wanted to share this map. It's a little bit small and hard to see, but one of the things that I think is super cool about this is that over the years, this Safe Routes to School program has received federal Safe Routes to School funding. The long dotted line in the middle is a 20-mile multi-use non-motorized trail that has received recreational trails program funding, which I'll share on the next slide. But here you can see the different schools, and you can see the routes that are highlighted that are either bike lanes or walking paths. And what I think is so wonderful about this map is, and when you can look it on the slides, you'll be able to see, is that, yes, ultimately this is about helping kids get to school on foot and on bikes safely, but this is also really helping community members of all ages access the Main Street community businesses, that 20-mile multi-use trail that can be used for running or biking or cross-country skiing in the winter. It connects to a number of parks and green spaces. And so really the Safe Routes to School program ends up offering benefits to people of all ages, not just school-aged kids. And so a couple of resources related to transportation alternatives, and within that, Safe Routes to School. As I mentioned, every state receives funding on an annual basis, and there's funding set aside for communities of all sizes. So there's funding set aside just for communities under 5,000, and there's funding for communities over 200,000 and everything in between. It's administered by state departments of transportation and in urbanized areas, metropolitan planning organizations. So I put a couple of helpful links on here, including a link to this infographic that helps you visualize, like, okay, there's the money at the federal level, but how do I get it? This will help you with this flow chart. And we also created state-specific fact sheets on the Transportation Alternatives Program that will tell you how much money your state has. And if you're in a community with 5 to 50,000 people, how much money is available just for communities of your size? And when we were able to find it, we indicated when the next competition is, and we certainly indicated the link for your state. And then I also just have another helpful link on here. So the last program that I wanted to talk about is called the Recreational Trails Program. So in terms of benefits, like all the other programs that we've highlighted, so many benefits, but a couple that I wanted to focus on are quality of life, connectivity, and health. And so the Recreational Trails Program really focuses on developing and maintaining trails and trail-related facilities. So that could include like a linear greenway that people walk and bike on the weekends. It could include, as I mentioned in that Idaho example, that multi-use path that people cross-country ski on in the winter. And this can also include like ATV trails and mountain biking trails and even boating or canoeing trails. And so it really offers these benefits of quality of life because people can be getting from point A to point B. They can serve a transportation function, but also it's just sometimes nice to be outside in nature and getting around that way. In terms of eligibility to apply, I'm sorry, I need to fix this slide as well, but we have the same organizations and entities that are eligible for TAP or eligible for the Recreational Trails Program. And I wanted to share an example from the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. And this is a project, the Moose Bog. And using Recreational Trails Program funding, they were able to develop and construct one of the state's longest ADA accessible trails in Vermont. And so I thought this one was really nice because in addition to focusing on accessibility, it also shows that not everything has to be from getting point A to point B, but this is also a way to be outside and walking or wheeling in nature, observing wildlife. I was reading all about the flora and fauna and the birds and leaf peeping in the area that were made available to people because of this funding. We have links, helpful links and resources on the Recreational Trails Program. So similar to transportation alternatives, every state receives funding for recreational trails, but a unique feature is that some states are allowed to opt out and a couple states do. And another one is that if you're interested in this, you should, this is administered by a state Department of Natural Resources. We know that that agency has a lot of different names based on the state, but basically your environmental agency administers this. And then we link here to the Recreational Trails Info website that has state profiles. So you can go through and see all the projects that have been funded with this. You can see profiles of them. You can get your state contact information. And then we also linked to information from the Federal Highway Administration on this program. And with that, I invite my co-presenters and our question and answer moderator, Melanie, to come back on video. I know we've had a lot of questions coming in. We also invite all of you to continue submitting your questions. And with that, I'll turn it over to Melanie to moderate the Q&A.
Hi, everyone. My name is Melanie Robinson. Like we mentioned earlier, I'm with the city's Connecting Children to Nature initiative, a joint partnership between NLC and the Children in Nature Network. I see lots of questions in the chat, so I will stop talking and hop over to those. Stephanie, I know you mentioned that the ORLP and I believe stateside programs require matching funds. Want to ask any of the other presenters how many of your grants, or if you could name the specific grants that require matching funds that you're aware of.
This is Carolyn. Let me jump in really quick on the state revolving funds. For the most part, those are loans, and so the community is not putting in the matching fund. You're paying your loan. So let me say that. And if I'm going to look up on my chart I have here about the carbon reduction program. So give me a minute, and I'll let Stephanie maybe jump in.
Yeah, just quickly on the revolving fund, I know that there has been some eligibility that allows for loans to be made into grants that can be forgiven, like loans that are forgiven, so they don't have to be paid back, but I'm not sure about what the match requirements are. But for the 4 programs I presented on, there is a 1-to-1 match requirement for all the arts and the LWCF programs.
And for the transportation programs that I shared about, so transportation alternatives, so they require a 20% match. However, in the bipartisan infrastructure law, there were a lot of flexibilities created on the match. And so I'll say recreational trails in particular got a lot of match flexibility increased. And so things like in kind can count, and you can credit donations and in kind that happen 18 months before you get the funding for recreational trails. So recreational trails has a ton of flexibility on the match. And then within transportation alternatives, there are also a number of new flexibilities on the match. So I will say, for starters, some states pay the match for their local governments or for the applicants. And so I can drop a link in the chat that can help you identify whether or not your state requires match. But then within the infrastructure law, there are a bunch of new flexibilities. So a state can offer a lower match for certain communities, like small communities or rural communities. And then there are some programs like Carolyn presented on the Community Development Block Grant. That's one of the only federal to federal programs that can be used as match for transportation alternatives. But yeah, there is a match required.
Okay, that's great comment, Marisa, on CDBG being used as a match. I don't see anything on carbon reduction program in terms of a match for local governments. But again, this is a money that is mostly going to the state. So depending on the usage and how that works at the state level is probably not a match. It's just that the state is going to be using those funds in certain areas.
And I'll just jump in to kind of add to what Marisa was saying about the in-kind versus cash. I believe for all 4 of the programs, the arts and the LWCF programs, or at least I know ORLP and the grants, the arts grants, you can use cash or in-kind donations as match. And similarly to how CDBG can be used as match for the Rec Trails program, for the LWCF programs, the only 2 federal sources of funding that can be used as match, as non-federal match for those 2 programs are the CDBG money and the Recreational Trails program. So that's really important to know as well.
Thanks so much, y'all. I am seeing a couple of comments that are pretty specific situations. So I'm going to generalize it a bit and ask you all if there exist any opportunities, resources, technical assistance through this program to help communities accomplish the goals that they can through each of the grants.
I can start. So this is another thing that's new within the bipartisan infrastructure law on the Transportation Alternatives Program, which is that states now have up to 5% of the money that they get, they can use to provide technical assistance to communities to develop projects, apply for the program, and then deliver projects. And that's something that's new this year. And so we have seen some states start to roll that out. I was just down in Louisiana and participated in an amazing workshop where the DOT was helping these rural communities pick projects, figure out how to apply. It was so cool and special. And we also know that some states were already doing this before the infrastructure law gave them money to do it. So there is technical assistance available. But because it's new, we really encourage that if you're interested in that, ask your Department of Transportation, request that, mention like, hey, we know you have this money to provide technical assistance. Like, we want help, please help us.
And on the water infrastructure piece, there will be technical assistance provided by the states as well as from EPA. And other organizations, like, for example, at National League of Cities, we have started a local infrastructure hub with 30 programs from the bipartisan infrastructure law and supporting communities over 2 years in terms of submitting an application to those programs. But specifically on water, you can turn to your state and EPA will be offering TA as well.
And I'll just add, for technical assistance for the National Endowment for the Arts, I don't think that actually, no, I lied. They do have a technical assistance provider through LISC, I believe. I don't know if it's specifically for grant recipients or also for applicants, but I believe they are their formal technical assistance provider. And their website is very thorough with a ton of resources. They basically walk you through the application process on their website, and they have a ton of resources available. They're very easy to work with and super understanding when you ask questions. In terms of the LWCF programs, their grant staff are also very eager to answer questions. The Trust for Public Land is also happy to work with people who have questions or about applications to work together. I don't believe there's a formal technical assistance provider at this time from the National Park Service, but there's a huge coalition of organizations that support the LWCF and would be happy to work with folks.
Thank you. Seeing a lot of call outs around equity and specifically a couple of opportunities. And so I just wanted to ask a question from the chat about whether there's money specifically available for rural communities.
Yeah, I can answer that. So within transportation alternatives, and again, like Safe Routes to School is eligible for that, there's money set aside for communities of different sizes. So on the flow chart that I shared, and you can pull that up, there's money set aside for communities under 5,000. And I don't want to conflate immediately like under 5,000 with rural, but there's definitely some overlap there. And so there is money set aside for under 5,000, 5,000 to 50,000, 50,000 to 200,000, then over 200,000. And one of the things when I look at the breakout of how much money is available, in a lot of, it's based on population and where people live and using the census. And so there are some states where a lot of their money is in that under 5,000 bucket. And then the other thing that I'll say about transportation alternatives and rural and equity is that also new this year in the infrastructure law is a provision requiring states to define and prioritize high need communities in their states. And the law was not prescriptive about what high need means, but it gave a couple of examples, including low income, transit dependent, and rural. And so some states are interpreting that as like, okay, we need to have like a special eye or attention to rural communities where there are not a lot of transportation options, and how might we prioritize those in project selection.
The other thing I'll flag is that the White House did put out a guidebook for rural communities that identifies some of those key opportunities. So perhaps we can share out a link to that in the follow-up email.
Yeah, and I'll just add for the arts programs, there is no requirement on the type of community that is applying or the community that will be impacted by the grant. So those are eligible to any communities that are interested in applying. And although ORLP is specifically for cities, the LWCF stateside, again, can be used by any type of community. There's no restriction on the size of the community that's applying.
Can I hop in for one moment? So I know we're at 3 o'clock, and that's typically the webinar length, and really want to recognize that people have to hop off for other calls. So thank you so much to everyone who's joined us. We are going to stay on for a couple more minutes because we recognize that we covered a ton of information and there are still a lot of questions, but I did just want to say goodbye and thank you to those who have had to drop off. And we're happy to stay on for a couple more minutes to answer questions.
Thank you. Seeing a question in the chat about whether skate parks are eligible for any of these opportunities. If you know offhand, please.
So I looked this one up and I didn't find the specific word from HUD on use of CDBG funds for skate parks, but a Google search showed me at least 2 communities that did use CDBG for skate parks. So I'll go with yes on that one.
And to support Carolyn in that answer, in the guidance document that she mentioned that's coming out about connecting children to nature, there are some examples of skate parks being used for some of those funds.
And I do believe that a skate park would be an eligible outdoor recreation amenity through the ORLP program, potentially also through the LWCF stateside.
And I'm sorry to be the downer that skate parks would not be eligible for the transportation programs. They all are very clear, like this has to serve a transportation purpose of getting somebody from point A to point B. And so there's a lot of specificity about like no walking tracks, no closed loop trails. And so yeah, I'm so happy that my colleagues know of funding opportunities that skate parks would be eligible for though. Thanks for your question.
Marisa, you can stay off mute. This next one's for you. Thinking about safe routes to schools grants, are PTAs eligible to apply on behalf of their school?
Yes, they are. So as long as it's like nonprofit, your PTA has a nonprofit status, you would be eligible to apply. And we've certainly seen PTAs take a leadership role in encouraging schools and school districts to apply for safe routes to school funding.
And then Carolyn, this question I believe was for you when you were speaking about the carbon reduction program. Is that funding only available for capital projects and not operating funds? Christopher, if I'm misrepresenting your question, please feel free to correct me in the chat, but I believe that's when that question was asked.
Yeah, I believe that's right. And also in relation to the Clean Water SRF and also CDBG. Can't be used for ongoing maintenance. And I know this is a challenge for some communities, particularly when we're talking about green infrastructure, because someone has to get out there and maintain it. But unfortunately, those can't come from the specific grant award.
And I would like to acknowledge that we've been using the term cities and communities a lot. We do have a question specifically about tribal nations and their funding. So if you would please call out the way that tribal nations are eligible for funding in the programs that you presented.
Yep, I'm happy to share. For the transportation programs, tribal nations are eligible to apply for all of the funding sources that I shared about. And there are some, I should double check this before I say it, but I think that the tribal transportation funds can be used as match for transportation alternatives. You know what? Don't quote me on that. I need to double check on that, but tribes are certainly eligible to apply for transportation alternatives program funds. And I'll look up the match.
I think many of the programs from the bipartisan infrastructure law have specific funding amounts for tribes. So it's not necessarily a competing with states or competing with cities, towns, and villages. There's many opportunities where there's the dedicated funding percentage from that grant for tribes. I don't have that information really accessible or off the top of my head, but I know that that is the case.
And for the Land and Water Conservation Fund and National Endowment for the Arts programs, tribes are eligible for all 4 of those programs.
And for the funds that are already available through BIL, Cameron wonders if the federal government will allow unspent early funds to be rolled over into future years' budgets as states are uptaking those.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that for the transportation alternatives program. So definitely hear you on like, this is a new law with tons of new requirements and provisions, and some states were slower to roll out their transportation alternatives competitions this year while they were getting situated. I do want to say we have seen some states like hit the ground running, get this going. That's been super exciting. But the Transportation Alternatives Program dollars do roll over. Basically, they have 4 years to spend them. So we know that some states run 2 years of funding competitions at a time, but it's not like, oh, if they didn't spend it by September 30, it's gone for transportation alternatives. That will roll forward. They've got 4 years.
I'm pretty sure CDBG funds have to be used in that particular fiscal year. With the water infrastructure funding, the state will award that either as a loan or a grant in a particular year. But just because these are long-term construction projects, it may not have to be actually spent in that year. And particularly with a loan, an SRF loan, you're going to be paying that back over the course of 20, 25, 30 years. So I'm not sure that answers the question. I think it's a maybe, but also depends on the program and the state and the agency.
And I'll just add that this LWCF stateside program is not under the bipartisan infrastructure law. It is also a formula grant program that does have to be spent within a certain time frame. So there is ample funding available through that program, and would highly recommend that folks apply for it so it gets spent.
I want to thank you all. We have about 2 minutes left. If you could just share 1 to 2 good ideas or recommendations when the people on our call are thinking about writing their grants. So they've chosen one, they're applying for a program. Do you have any application advice for them?
Yeah, I can start. So for transportation alternatives, most states they publish a guidance document that says, like, here's what we're going to score you on. You get this many points if this is touching a school with a high percentage of students with free and reduced school lunch. You get 20 points if you talk about how this is going to connect not only help people get around on bike or on foot, but it'll also help people access a grocery store or their doctor's office. I just highly encourage you to look at your state Department of Transportation's guidance document and look at what it is that they are prioritizing, what will give you the most points. We know that there are some states that say, we will give you more points if this is a safe route to school program. So definitely look at that. The DOTs are trying to help you be successful. And if you, I'm going to put a link in the chat, and it's also in the slide deck, but for where you can find your State Department of Transportation website on transportation alternatives to figure out like what it is. And yeah, just generally I would say like, think about the benefits that this offers your community and write about those in your application. Humanize it, tell a good story.
And I guess I would flip the order in which you're thinking about this and really go to your project, start with your project list and then match that to a grant opportunity that can help you achieve that goal. But in terms of, once you have done that, in terms of writing the grant, I would focus on telling the narrative and the benefits to the community and the people with this project. You really got to sell the project, and that means tying it into real life benefits to residents, and do it in a way that touches on equity and inclusion. Marisa was mentioning this. Climate and resilience and equity, those are really the overarching principles of the bipartisan infrastructure law. And especially if you're applying to the federal government for your grant, they're going to be looking for those connections.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Really talking about the benefits to people, the people that this project will be impacting is really important. I think another way to tell that story is through data. So, Trust for Public Land has a ParkServe database that kind of shows the different characteristics of the people that are within a 10-minute walk of an existing or potential park. So that's one way of showing those that data. I know that the White House Center on Environmental Quality has a tool that they're rolling out. I think the EPA has a environmental justice mapping tool to show communities and environmental justice communities, and really making sure to incorporate that data into your storytelling can make for a really strong application.
Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Marisa to close us out. Panelists, there are still some questions in the chat, so if you have an answer to them, please feel free to type. Otherwise, thanks again.
Thanks so much, Melanie, for your skillful moderation. Really appreciate you synthesizing a lot of those questions because there were a lot coming in. So thank you so much, everyone who was able to join us today. We really appreciate your interest and commitment to improving access to the outdoors, improving access for your community members to each other, and for your work to build strong, thriving, healthy, and equitable communities. Thank you so much to my co-presenters, Carolyn and Stephanie. We at Safe Routes Partnership so appreciate the partnership of your organizations, and really recognize again, the interconnectedness of our work. Thank you all so much. We will be sharing the slides and the recording. You will get a link to that, and we will post it on our website at saferoutespartnership.org. Thank you again to everyone, and hope that you have a great day. Take care.